let's introduce Ruohui. So Dr. Ruohui Wang is currently a senior researcher in Shanghai AI Lab, responsible for organizing university courses and professional tutorials on computer vision and OpenMMLab. Previously, Ruohui worked as a leading developer of MM Editing, a toolbox in OpenMMLab. Before joining the OpenMMLab, Ruohui obtained his PhD degree from MMLab, the Chinese University of Hong Kong.
Hello, this is Ruohui from Shanghai AI Laboratory, and in this section, I will introduce the basic usage and some overall design of the OpenMM project. So I will cover the following topics, including the installation and the inference with pre-trained models, model training, testing, and deployment. And I will introduce config files and some internal mechanisms to make things work. And finally, I will introduce how to do some customization. So the first part is installation, and it is the start of our journey. As we have seen, OpenMMLab is a collection of several toolboxes as shown in this figure. And so first, it is based on PyTorch, and then we build MMCV and MMEngine as common base libraries, and other toolboxes are built upon both MMCV and MMEngine. And so to install a specific package, you need to install a full stack of dependencies. And because MMCV contains some extended operators written in C and CUDA, it also depends on the version of PyTorch and also the CUDA version of PyTorch. So a correct installation usually takes some effort. And to make things easier, we provide pre-built MMCV packages and also develop the tool named MMM to solve such dependencies automatically. So to use MIM, we just need to install MIM first, and then install MMCV using MIM. MIM install instead of pip install, and MIM will detect the version of PyTorch and CUDA automatically and download the corresponding pre-built MMCV to install. And here you need to make sure to specify the 2.0 RC to install the new version. And in this installation step, MMEngine will be installed as dependencies automatically. So after install MMCV, we can install other toolboxes, again using MIM. So this method is more convenient if you just want to use some packages without modifying the source code. And we also recommend installing from the source. And this method is more convenient if you need to frequently modify the source code and to test some new ideas. So we can git clone the source code and check out to the new branch, and finally install the toolbox in editable mode via MIM. So an important note on version is that currently OpenMMLab 2.0 toolboxes are all in release candidate versions. So one need to manually specify the version number to install the new version. And so, for example, the new version of MMCV is 2.0, and the MM classification is 1.0, and the MM detection is 3.0. And if you install from the source, and you can check the version number from GitHub. And usually a master branch indicates the old version, and the following one indicates the new version. And for some recently developed toolbox, it has only the main branch, and which indicates the new variant. Okay, so this is the installation part. And once you have installed the OpenMMLab, you can immediately enjoy a big collection of pre-trained models and use them to perform inference. And OpenMMLab implements more than 300 computer vision models and provides more than 2,300 pre-trained model weights, and all with SOTA performance. And so to perform inference, we only need 4 steps. And the first one, we need to select model from the model zoo, and then we need to download the model. And we need to write some Python codes to initialize the model and perform inference. And optionally, you can visualize your results. So let's go through these steps one by one. So the first step is to select the model from the model zoo. So for each repository, the full list of the models are organized under the config directory. So, and here we select the RTM dat as the example. So this is a real-time model for object detection, and it is developed by our team. So for each model, we provide a bunch of pre-trained model weights. And every pre-trained model is associated with a config file, which includes the definition of the model structure and a checkpoint file, which store the learned weights. And also we also associate metrics and training logs for reference. So after you have pick up a model, the second step is to download the model, which means you need to download both the config file and the checkpoint file. So here we also offer two options. The first one is to use MIM again. So you need to remember and pass the name of the config here to MIM, and the MIM will automatically download both the config file and the checkpoint file to the destination you specified here. And another option is to download manually from these hyperlinks. So after you have downloaded a model, you can write some Python codes to perform inference. So usually this step involves 3 APIs. The first one is register all modules. And this is necessary for the following codes to work. And we will introduce the details later. And the second one is init detector. And this is for object detection. And for other tasks, the API may be in models. It depends on specific toolboxes. And we can pass the path to the config file and the checkpoint file we have just downloaded, and it will build the model and load the pre-trained weights. And finally, we call an inference detector with the model and an example image, and it will perform inference and return the detection results in a unified data structure. So it was mentioned that all these codes are applied to all OpenMMLab toolboxes with only some possible difference on function names. For example, if you use API MM classification, the API could be init model and inference model. Okay, and then finally, and optionally, you can write some codes to visualize the result. So for example, you can visualize the bounding box in object detection and or visualize the mask in semantic segmentation. And we will not cover much details here, so you can refer to the documentation site for more details. Okay, so this is a part of inference, and let's move on to training. So the first thing you may want to do is to reproduce training. So as we have seen, each repository provides a list of models, and actually most of these models are trained by OpenMMLab toolbox themselves, and they can achieve certain performance. So reproducing training is actually either the inference. There are only 2 steps, and even without writing codes. And the first step is to prepare a data set, for example, the ImageNet data set for classification or COCO data set for object detections. For details, you can always refer to the documentation of each toolbox. And after you have prepared the data set, you can launch the training with the config file. So this config file is actually the same one we have used in inference, but it actually defines not only the model, but also everything required to launch the training, including the model, the data set, and the learning algorithm, and so on. So we also offer 2 options to launch the training. So the first one is to use the training tools. You can just call Python training tools, tools train, and pass the config file as arguments. And so the second option is to use MIM train. And so actually these 2 commands do the same thing. You can pick anyone you like. So during training, the program will output some logs and periodically save some checkpoints to a specific directory called the working directory. So here is an example. So the orange ones are training logs, and the blue ones are checkpoints, and which contains the state of the model and the optimizer. And if the training program is interrupted accidentally, we can resume from these checkpoints. So the program will also save a copy of the config under the working directory. And the working directory is this work dir and by default under the current working directory, and you can also manually specify another working directory with these options. Okay, and after you have trained the model, we can use the test tools to evaluate the model and compute the performance metrics. And the test tool require the config file and the checkpoint file. So data used to test the model are also defined in the config file, and the checkpoint file is just saved during training under the working directory. And we can optionally output the full result or to visualize the result by passing more arguments. So, and alternatively, we can also use MIM to test the model. We also developed the tools for distributed training, and so the command line interface is almost the same as single GPU training. So for example, we need config file and the checkpoint file here, and all you need to do is to switch to the distributed training tools or testing tools. And if your computing clusters support Slurm, we also offer tools for using the Slurm task managers. And also, you can use MIM to do distributed training, and the command line interface is more clear. You can just specify the number of GPUs and some Slurm arguments here. And you can check this page, and which is the main page of MIM for more use cases. An important note is about learning rate scaling. So we know the linear scaling rule, which indicates that if you use different number of GPUs to train the model, and the learning rate should be set proportionally to the total batch size, which is the multiplication of the batch size on a single GPU and the total number of GPUs. So most of the config file are tuned on 8 GPU servers in OpenMMLab. And so if you use different number of GPUs, you generally need to scale the learning rate manually. But to simplify this process, we also support automatic learning rate scaling by passing one more argument to the training tool. And the training tool will detect the actual number of GPU and scale the learning rate automatically. And additionally, we also offer more functionalities in the training tool, such as resume training from accident interruption and automatic mixed precision training by passing different arguments. And you can always check the help for more options. So another common scenario is to train model based on users' own data set. OpenMMLab offers 2 methods to accomplish these tasks. So the first one is to convert your model, convert your data set to a standard format. For example, ImageNet format for image classification, or COCO format for object detection, and instance segmentation. And this method is usually easier. Once you have organized the data set, existing codes can directly read and parse the data. And we only need to modify some meta information in the configuration file, and you don't need to modify the source codes. And another option is to implement a new data set. Another option is to implement a new dataset class. And this option requires you to write some codes to read and parse your dataset, as well as some modification to the config file. So this method is generally more efficient because you don't need additional storage to store the organized data, and you can always and you can check this documentation site for more examples for these options. Okay. So finally, for production purpose, we also want to deploy the model to some target devices to make the computation more efficient. So deploy is for this purpose. And to deploy a model, one needs to provide the config file and the checkpoint file of a model, and also a deployment config, which defines the backend, the input shape, and the data type, and some other items required to deploy the model. And okay, so this is the part of model training, testing, and deployment. And we move to the next part of config files. So as we have seen in previous two sections, so config file plays a very important role. In this section, we will reveal more details on the config files. So we have used config files in both inference and the training tasks. And a config file is essentially a bunch of key value pairs organized in a Python format, which defines everything required to train or to test a model. Generally, they can be divided into four major parts: the model parts, the dataset part, the optimizer part, and the runtime part. Let's go through these four parts one by one. So the first one is the model part. It defines the structure of the model. And this example is taken from classification, and it defines an image classifier based on ResNet 50 structure. And here, as we can see here, the model key corresponds to a very big nested Python dictionary, and it contains a subkey named type. Okay, so this specifies the model as the image classifier. And the model config also contains some nested key value pairs, which defines the submodule of the model. So in this example, the image classifier consists of a ResNet 50 module as the backbone, and a global average pooling module as neck, and a linear layer with cross entropy loss as the classification head. So this is the model part. And the second part is the data part. So the data part is usually consists of three data loaders, and the train data loader, the validation data loader, and the test data loader, respectively. And the argument list is aligned with PyTorch's data loader, which you are already familiar with. And the data loader contains a dataset key here, which specifies the type of the dataset to pass to the dataset files and a pre-processing pipeline. Okay. And the pipeline usually defines how the data is loaded from the past, and how data is and how data augmentation is performed. So in this example, the image is first loaded from past to the image, and we do some random resize crop and random flip as data augmentation, and finally output the tensor and the label and some meta informations in the unified data structure as the output of the dataset. Okay. And before sending the data to the model, we also need to transfer the data to the GPU and do some pixel normalization and batch them together. And these steps are done in another module called the data preprocessor. And there is also a config item corresponding to this module in the config files. Okay, so this is the data part. And the third part is about optimizers and the learning rate schedulers. So in this example, we configure an SGD optimizer with learning rate 0.8, and we set two learning rate schedulers. One is to warm up the learning rate at the beginning of training, and the other one is to decay the learning rate following a cosine curve. And here we can define the number of total epochs to be 100, and validate the model every one epoch during training. And this additional option is for an automatic learning rate scaling, as we have introduced previously. So the fourth part defines some supporting items, and we call them the runtime configs. And some commonly used item includes the interval of printing logs and the saving checkpoints. And we can also define the visualizer, which will save some images or visualization results during training. And if we want to initialize the model from some other pre-trained weights, we can we can set this load from key, and if we want to reuse and if we want to resume training from some other checkpoints, we can set this resume key. And also we can set random seed in this part. And also we can set some environmental variables for distributed training. And all these items are gathered together to form the runtime part. Okay, so to summarize, there are 4 parts in the configuration file, and they are the model parts, the data part, and the optimizer part, and the runtime part. And all these items together defines a specific environment. And all these items together define a specific experiment. Okay, so a trick worth mentioning here is that when writing configuration files in Python, you can use intermediate variables. So as we can see here, the train pipeline can be defined completely outside the train loader. And we will fill the variable, this train pipeline variable, as the value of the train pipeline key. So this trick makes the whole config file more clear, and this trick is heavily used in predefined config files. And another feature of the config file is that it supports inheritance. So imagine that you want to train the same model using different optimizers or different data sets. So generally you need to write multiple config files, but the model part is completely shared. But if you rewrite it once in multiple config files, is really redundant. Okay, so config file inheritance solve this issue in an elegant way. So for example, we can first create a config file of the model as the base config. And then we can create an optimizer config as the child config. And in the optimizer config, we specify the model config as the base config. So when you use the child config, which is the optimizer config, so items in the base config will be inherited, and the keys in the child config will be appended or updated to the base one. So for example, in this base one, we define the learning rate to be we define the type of the optimizer to be SGD, and in the child one, we modify it to Adam. So as a result, the final config file take Adam as the optimizer instead of SGD. So with the config file inheritance, we can also write short and clean configs. So config inheritance is also heavily used in OpenMMLab projects, and we usually organize base configurations in the base directory, and the configs for specific experiments are usually inherited of base configs and plus some additional items. So in this example, the config is a combination of 4 base configs, including a ResNet 50 model config, and ImageNet dataset config, and a common optimizer config for training on ImageNet, and the default runtime configs. Okay, so here we have finished the part of the config file, and actually the config file is the most important part of the OpenMMLab project, and most of our time will be spent on the configuration file. So hopefully you have already understand it. Okay, and then let's move on to some internal mechanisms. Okay, so the first topic is about how config files comes to work. So in previous section, we have seen this config as a ResNet 50 image classifier. You may be curious about how this nested dictionary, which is a dictionary of strings and integers, is finally converted to an actual torch model. So you still remember the type key here. And actually there is a corresponding class implementation in the code base. And when you specify the target, when you specify the type, the program will find the target class and instantiate it. So other key value pairs are passed to the int function of this class as keyword arguments. So in this example, the backbone part, the neck part, and the head part, which are 3 dictionaries here, are all passed to the init function of the image classifier to initialize or to instantiate the image classifier model. Okay, and this nested dictionaries will be recursively built and instantiated within the image classifier. Just like this. And for example, this ResNet config will be converted or built to an actual ResNet module within the image classifier. And to make this mechanism work, we need another module called the registry. So it is actually a mapping from the class name to the class itself. So if you view the source code, there will be a decorator on each class implementation. So when you import this module, the ResNet module will be added to the registry. Just like this, key from ResNet to the actual ResNet class. And if you specify ResNet as the type in the config file, the registry will look up this name and get the actual class and finally build the module like this. So to make the registry work, we need to register all class into the registry. And this is why we need to call the registry all modules in the inference part. And the registry also allow using modules from other toolboxes. So this example config is taken from detection, and this toolbox is for object detection. And it uses a backbone from classification. And here we just specify the type as CLS dot connects. So it will search this module in the registry of classification instead of the registry in detection. Okay. So the next topic is about the runner. So before going into some details, let's consider a typical program written in PyTorch like this. So to train the model using some data, we first need to define the model and the data set and the data loader, the optimizer. And then we will typically write some for loops, okay? And we will iterate the training data loader for several epochs. And in each iteration, we fetch the data. We fetch a batch of data and compute the loss. And then back propagate to compute some gradients and update the model parameters using the optimizer. And at the end of every epoch, we do a validation. And after training, we do the testing and to compute some performance metrics. So this framework is almost the same regardless of the data, the model, and the optimizer. And so we abstract this framework to be a runner. So it will initialize the model, data loader, and the optimizer as input and run these loops internally, and finally output the trained model, and the test metrics. And so with this design, the training framework and the actual implementation of different data sets and the models are decoupled. So Engine implements the runner, and the downstream toolbox will focus on models, data, and other detailed implementations. So you still remember the config file? It actually defines the whole argument list of the runner. So for example, here we can see the model part, train validation and test data loaders, and some optimizers, and also some runtime configs here. Okay. And the search mechanism is about the hooks. And the hook is actually a general programming paradigm, which allows user to insert arbitrary functions at a specific location of a program. So currently, the runners support more than 20 hooks locations for users to do some customization. And the hook functions will take the whole runner as argument, so it is very flexible, and you can do anything you like to the runner. And so Engine already implements some default hooks. And so, for example, the checkpoint hook we have seen in the runtime config will be executed at the after train epoch location, and which is the end of every training epoch, and as shown in this figure. And this hook will fetch the model and the optimizer from the runner, because it can take the runner as the argument. And we can fetch, and the checkpoint hook will fetch the state dict of the model and the optimizer and save them to the disks as a checkpoint. So of course, user can also define their own hook functions and set them into the config files to make them work. Okay, and if you are interested in more internal designs, you can check the documentation of Engine, and there are a series of topics, and which explain in more details. Okay, and the final part is about customization. Here, I just want to introduce the general idea. So with the help of the registry, we can do customization in a very easy way. As we have just explained, the registry maintains a mapping from the class names to the actual class themselves. And then, when we supply the types in the configuration files, the registry will look up and to get the class and then build it based on the argument list. And to implement a customized module, we can just implement it and put it into the registry. And to accomplish this, we need to add a decorator when writing our customized modules, and add a custom import item in the configuration file. So, and you need to also ensure the this module, and which is actually this file name, is able to be imported, and you can put it under the current working directory or some path under the Python path. So, so after we do this step, we can specify the customized model in the configuration file. So as this one is already registered in the registry, so it will successfully be built in the runner. And the actual implementation is in this my module part. So, so this is a general idea and some steps to customize a model. And if you need more concrete examples on how to customize everything, including the model part, including the model, the data, the pipelines, the optimizer, the hooks, and everything else, and you can check check our documentations, and there are very detailed and concrete examples. And here and for more examples and tutorials, you can always check the demo folder of every toolboxes. And remember to check out to the new branch, and you will find quite a lot of interesting demos here. And just play some of them, and it will help you to understand how OpenMMLab works. Okay. And so this is my part of presentation. Thank you very much. And any questions? No questions.
Thank you. Can I ask questions?
Yes.
So very amazing framework. Thank you very much. So I want to try it. So one problem I face as a new user is to write the correct config file. Mm-hmm. And so from my experience, yeah, it helps to have a very nice tutorials and manuals as you provide, but can there also be some kind of graphical user interface, for example, so that I can quickly test some ideas? I think it's not currently available, but is there some plan to develop that kind of suggestion tool or assistance tool?
Okay, so you are talking about maybe some GUI and
yeah, to generate or modify config files.
Okay, and I think we have some internal systems currently in development, but I'm not sure whether it when it will be released sorry, I'm not sure when it will be released to public. And currently, most of the config file are usually based on the text interface, and also if you want to write ensure your config is correct, you can just try to start from some predefined ones. Maybe let me show you. Maybe here. Sorry, here. And maybe you can first start from some predefined ones and just try to modify some items, and so usually these steps will be stable, and you can also get a correct one. And usually, if you write something wrong, it will the runner will give you some error messages, and you can just based on these error messages to modify or to correct some errors. Okay, so.
Yeah, thank you. I will be enjoying trying out those systems.